Hi, guys. Okay, we're reading chapters 12, 13, and 14 today. The first chapter is called Where Was Mama? Mr. Rosen tripped on the loose step outside the kitchen door. His wife grasped his arm, and he regained his balance. It's very dark, Mama whispered, as they stood in the yard with their blankets and bundles of food gathered in their arms. And we can't use any kind of light. I'll go first. I know the way very well. And you follow me. Try not to stumble over the tree roots in the path. Feel carefully with your feet. The path is uneven. And be very, very quiet, she added, unnecessarily. The night was quiet, too. A slight breeze moved in the tops of the trees, and from across the meadow came the sound of the sea's movement, which was a constant sound here and had always been. But no birds called or cried here now in the night. The cow slept silently in the barn, the kitten upstairs in Kirsty's arms, and there were stars here and there, dotting the sky among the clouds, but no moon. Anne-Marie shivered, standing at the foot of the steps. Come, Mamma murmured, and she moved away from the house. One by one the Rosens turned and hugged Anne-Marie silently. Ellen came to her last. The two girls held each other. I'll come back someday, Ellen whispered fiercely. I promise. I know you will, Anne-Marie whispered back, holding her friend tightly. Then they were gone, Mamma and the Rosens. Anne-Marie was alone. She went into the house, crying suddenly, and closed the door against the night. The lid of the casket was closed again. Now the room was empty. There was no sign of the people who had sat there for these hours. Anne-Marie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She opened the dark curtains in the windows, and she curled once more in the rocker, trying to relax. She traced their route in her mind. She knew the old path, too, not as well as her mother, who had followed it almost every day of her childhood, with her dog scampering behind. But Anne-Marie had often walked to town and back that way, and she remarked the turns, the twisted trees whose gnarled roots pushed the earth now, and then into knotted clumps and thick bushes that often flowered in early summer. She walked with them in her mind, feeling the way through the darkness. It would take them, she thought, half an hour to reach the place where Uncle Henrik was waiting in his boat. Mamma would leave them there, pausing a minute, no more, for a final hug. Then she would turn and come home. It would be easier and faster for Mamma alone, with no need to wait at the Rosens, unfamiliar with the path, slowly felt their way along. Mamma would hurry, sure-footed, back to her children. The clock in the hall struck once. It was 2:30 in the morning. Her mother would be home in an hour, Anne-Marie decided. She rocked gently back and forth in the old chair. Mamma would be home by 3:30. She thought of Papa back in Copenhagen alone. He would be awake too. He would be wishing he would have come, but knowing too that he must come and go, as always, to the corner store for the newspaper, to the office when morning came, and now he would be afraid for them, and watching the clock, waiting for word that the Rosens were safe, that Mom and the girls were at the farm, starting a new day with the sun shining through the kitchen window and the cream in their oatmeal. It was harder for the ones who were waiting, Anne-Marie knew. Less danger, perhaps, but more fear. She yawned and her head nodded. She fell asleep, and it was a sleep as thin as night clouds, dotted with dreams that came and went like stars. Light woke her, but it was not really morning, not yet. It was only the first hint of slightly lightening sky, a pale gleam at the edge of the meadow, a sign that far away somewhere, to the east where Sweden still slept, morning would be coming soon. Dawn would creep across the Swedish farmland and coast, and it would wash little Denmark with light and move across the North Sea to wake Norway. Anne-Marie blinked in confusion, sitting up, remembering after a moment where she was and why. But it was not right. The pale light at the horizon, it should still be dark. It should still be night. She stood stiffly, stretching her legs, and went to the hall to look at the old clock. It was past 4 o'clock. Where was Mamma? Perhaps she had come home and not wanted to wake Anne-Marie, and had gone to bed herself. Surely that was it. Mamma must have been exhausted. She had been up all night and had made the dangerous journey to the boat and returned through the dark woods, wanting only to sleep. Quickly, Anne-Marie went up the narrow staircase. The door to the bedroom where she had slept with Ellen was open. The two small beds were neatly made, covered with old quilts, and empty beside it. Empty. Beside it, Uncle Henry's door was open too, and his bed too was unused and empty. Despite her worry, Anne-Marie smiled slightly when she saw some of Henrik's clothes crumpled in a chair and a pair of shoes, caked with the barnyard dirt, lying on the floor. "He needs a wife," she said to herself, imitating Mama. The door to the other bedroom, the one Kirsty and Mama were sharing, was closed. Quietly, not wanting to wake them, Anne-Marie pushed it open. The kitten's ears moved, standing up straight, its eyes wide open, and it raised its head and yawned. It pried itself out of Kirsty's arms, stretched, and then jumped lightly to the floor and came to Anne-Marie. It rubbed itself against her leg and purred. Kirsty sighed and turned in her sleep. One arm, free now of the kitten's warmth and comfort, flung itself across the pillow. There was no one else in the wide bed. Anne-Marie moved quickly to the window, which overlooked the clearing that led to the path's entrance. The light outside was still very dim, and she peered through the dimness, trying to see and looking for the opening in the trees where the path began, looking for Mama hurrying home. After a second, she saw a shape there, something unfamiliar, something that had not been there the day before, a dark shape, no more than a blurred heap at the beginning of the path. Anne-Marie squinted, forcing her eyes to understand, needing to understand, but not wanting to understand. The shape moved, and she knew it was her mother lying on the earth. Chapter 13. Run as fast as you can. Still moving quietly so as not to wake her sister, Anne-Marie sped down the stairs and through the kitchen door. Her foot caught the loose step, and she faltered for a moment, righting herself, and then dashed across the ground to place where her mother lay. "Mama!" she called desperately. "Mama!" "Shh!" Mama said, raising her head. "I'm all right." "But Mama," Anne-Marie asked, kneeling beside her, "what's wrong? What happened?" Her mother pulled herself to a sitting position. She winced in pain. "I'm all right, really. Don't worry. And the Rosens are with Henrik. That's the important thing." She smiled a little, though her face was drawn with pain, and she bit her lip, the smile fading. "We got there quite quickly, even though it was so dark, and it was difficult for the Rosens, not knowing the path. Henrik was there waiting on the boat, and he took them aboard and down below so quickly to the cabin that they were invisible in an instant. He said to the others that were already there, Peter got them there safely too. So I turned and hurried home. I was so anxious to get back to you girls. I should have been more careful." Talking softly, she brushed some grass and dirt from her hands. "Can you believe it? I was fairly nearly here, well, maybe just halfway, when I tripped over a root and went sprawling." Mama sighed. "So clumsy," she said, as if she were scolding herself. "I'm afraid my ankle is broken, Anne-Marie. Thank goodness it is nothing worse. An ankle mends, and I am home, and the Rosens are with Henrik." "You should have seen me, Anne-Marie," she said, shaking her head with a wry look. "Your proper Mama crawling inch by inch. I probably look like a drunkard." She reached for Anne-Marie's arm. "Here, let me lean on you. I think if you support me on this side, I can make my way up to the house." "Goodness, what a clumsy fool I am. Here, let me put my arm over your shoulders. You're such a good, strong, brave girl. Now, very slowly. There." Mama's face was white with pain. Anne-Marie could see it, even through the faint light of the approaching dawn. She hobbled, leaning heavily on her daughter, pausing again and again toward the house. "When we get inside, I'll have a cup of tea, and then we'll call the doctor. I'll tell him that I fell on the stairs. You'll have to help me wash away the grass and the twigs. Here, Anne-Marie, let me rest for a minute." They had reached the house, and Mama sank down the steps and sat. She took several deep breaths. Anne-Marie sat beside her and held her hand. "Mama, I was so worried when you didn't come back." Mama nodded. I knew you would be. I thought of you worrying and I dragged myself along. But here I am safe with you now. Everything is fine. What time is it? It must be 4:30 or close to it. They will sail soon. Mama turned her head and gazed across the meadow to the sea and the vast sky above it. There were no stars now, only the gray, pale sky with pinkness at its borders. Soon they will be safe too. Anne-Marie relaxed. She stroked her mother's hand and looked down at the discolored, swollen ankle. Mama, what is this? She asked suddenly, reaching into the grass at the foot of the steps. Mama looked. She gasped. Oh my goodness, she said. Anne-Marie, pick it up. She recognized it now and knew what it was. It was the packet that Peter had given to Mr. Rosen. Mr. Rosen tripped on the step, remember? It must have fallen from his pocket. We'll have to save it and give it back to Peter. Anne-Marie handed it to her mother. Do you know what it is? Her mother didn't answer. Her face was stricken. She looked at the path and down at her ankle. It's important, isn't it, Mama? It was for Uncle Henrik. I remember Peter said it was very important. I heard him tell Mr. Rosen. Her mother tried to stand but fell back against the steps with a groan. My God, she murmured again. It may have all been for nothing. Anne-Marie took the packet from her mother's hand and stood. I will take it, she said. I know the way, and it's almost light now. I can run like the wind. Mama spoke quickly, her voice tense. Anne-Marie, go into the house and get the small basket on the table. Quickly, quickly. Put an apple into it and some cheese. Put this packet underneath. Do you understand? Hurry. Anne-Marie did instantly what she was told. The basket, the packet at the bottom. She covered it with a napkin, then wrapped some cheese, an apple, and she glanced around the kitchen, saw some bread, and added that too. The little basket was full. She took it to where her mother was. You must run to the boat. If anyone should stop you, who would stop me? Anne-Marie, you understand how dangerous this is. If any soldiers see you, if they stop you, you must pretend to be nothing more than a little girl, a silly, empty-headed little girl taking lunch to a fisherman, a foolish uncle who forgot his bread and cheese. Mama, what is it in the bottom? But her mother still didn't answer the question. Go, she said firmly. Go right now and run as fast as you can. Anne-Marie kissed her mother quickly, grabbed the basket from her mother's lap, and turned and ran toward the path. Chapter 14, On the Dark Path. Only now, entering the woods on the footpath, did Anne-Marie realize how cold the dawn was. She had watched and helped earlier as the others donned sweaters, jackets, and coats, and she had peered into the night, following them with her eyes as they moved silently off, bulky in their garments, blankets in their arms. But she wore only a light sweater over her cotton dress. Though the October day later would be warmed by sunlight, now it was gray, chilly, and damp, and she shivered. The path curved, and she would no longer look behind her and see the clearing with the farmhouse outlined against the pale sky and the lighting meadow beyond. Now there were only the dark woods ahead underfoot. The path, latticed with thick roots, hidden under the fallen leaves, was invisible. She felt her way with her feet, trying not to stumble. The handle of the straw basket scratched her arm through her sweater. She shifted it and tried to run. She thought of a story she had often told Kirsty as they cuddled in bed at night. Once upon a time there was a little girl, she told herself silently, who had a beautiful red cloak. Her mother had made it for her. She wore it so often that everyone called her Little Red Riding Hood. Kirsty would always interrupt there. Why was it called a Red Riding Hood? Kirsty would always ask. Why didn't they just call her Little Red Cloak? Well, it had a hood that covered her head. She had beautiful curls like you, Kirsty. Maybe someday Mama will make you a coat with a hood to cover your curls and keep you warm. But why? Kirsty would ask. Was it a riding hood? Was she riding a horse? Maybe she had a horse that she rode sometimes, but not in this story. Now stop interrupting every minute. Anne-Marie smiled, feeling her way through the dark, remembering how Kirsty always interrupted stories to ask questions. Often she just wanted to make the stories last longer. The story continued. One day, the little girl's mother said, I want you to take a basket of food to your grandmother. She is sick in bed. Come, let me tie your red cloak." "The grandmother lived deep in the woods, didn't she?" Kirsty would ask. "In the dangerous woods where wolves lived." Anne-Marie heard a small voice, a squirrel perhaps, or a rabbit scampering nearby. She paused, stood still on a path, and smiled again. Kirsty would have been frightened. She would have grabbed Anne-Marie's hand and said, "A wolf!" But Anne-Marie knew that these woods were not like the woods in the story. There were no wolves or bears or tigers, none of the beasts that populated Kirsty's vivid imagination. She hurried on. Still, they were very dark, these woods. Anne-Marie had never followed this path in the dark before. She had told her mother she would run, and she tried. Her path turned. She knew the turning well, though it seemed different in the dark. If she turned to the left, it would take her to the road out where it would be lighter, wider, and more traveled, but more dangerous too. Someone could see her on the road. At this time of dawn, other fishermen would be on the road, hurrying to their boats for the long day at sea, and there might be soldiers. She turned to the right and headed deeper into the woods. It was why Mama and Peter had to guide the girls, those who were strangers here, the Rosens and the others. A wrong turn would have taken them into danger. So Little Red Riding Hood carried the basket of food and hurried along the woods. It was a lovely morning, and the birds were singing. Little Red Riding Hood sang, too, as she walked. Sometimes she changed that part of the story, telling it to Kirsty. Sometimes it was raining or even snowing in the woods. Sometimes it was evening with long, frightening shadows, so that Kirsty, listening, would snuggle closer and wrap her arms around Anne-Marie. But now, telling it to herself, she wanted sunlight and birdsong. Here the path widened and flattened. It was the place where the woods opened on one side, and the path curved beside a meadow at the edge of the sea. Here she could run, and she did. Here in the daylight, there would have been cows in the meadow on a summer afternoon. Anne-Marie would always stop by the fence and hold out handfuls of grass, which the curious cows would take with their rough tongues. Here her mother had told her. Mama would always stop, too, as a child walking to school. Her dog, Trofast, would wriggle under the fence and run about in the meadow, barking excitedly, trying to chase the cows, who always ignored him. The meadow was empty now, and the colorless in the half-light. She could hear the churning sea beyond and see the wash of daylight to the east over Sweden. She ran as fast as she could, searching with her eyes for the place ahead where the path would re-enter the woods in its final segment, which led to town. Here the bushes were overgrown and it was difficult to see the path. But she found the entrance beside the high blueberry bushes. How often she had stopped there in late summer to pick a handful of the sweet berries. Her hands and mouth would be blue afterwards. Mama always laughed when she came home. Now it was dark again, and the trees and the bushes closed around her, and she had to move more slowly, though she still tried to run. Anne-Marie thought of Mama, her ankle so swollen and her face so pained. She hoped Mama had called the doctor by now. The local doctor was an old man, brusque and businesslike, tough with kind eyes. He had come to the farmhouse several times during the summers of the past, his battered car noisy on the dirt road. He had come once when Kirsty, a tiny baby then, had been sick and wailing with an earache. And he had come when Lise had spilled hot grease cooking breakfast and burned her hand. Anne-Marie turned again as the path divided once more, then left the fork would take her directly to the village. It was the way they had come from the train and the way Mama had walked to school as a girl. But Anne-Marie turned to the right, heading now toward the harbor side, where the fishing boats lay at anchor. She had often come this way before, too, sometimes at the end of the afternoon, to pick out the Ingeborg, Uncle Henrik's boat, from the many returning, and to watch him and his helpers unload the day's catch of slippery, shimmering herring still flopping in their containers. Even now, with the boats in the harbor ahead empty of fish, preparing to leave for the day's fishing, she could smell the oily, salty scent of the herring, which always remained in the air here. It wasn't far now. It was getting lighter. She ran almost as fast as she had run to school in the Friday foot races. Almost as fast as she had run down the Copenhagen sidewalk on the day that the soldier had stopped her with his call of "Halt!" Anne-Marie continued the story in her head. Suddenly, as Little Red Riding Hood walked through the woods, she heard a noise. She heard a rustling in the bushes. "A wolf?" Kirsty would always say, shivering with fearful delight. "I know it's going to be the wolf." Anne-Marie always tries to prolong this part, to build up the suspense and tantalize her sister. She didn't know what it was. She stopped on the path and listened. Something was following her in the bushes. Little Red Riding Hood was very, very, very frightened. She would stop, would stay silent for a moment, and beside her in bed she could feel Kirsty holding her breath. Then Anne-Marie would go on in a low, dread-filled voice. She heard a growl. Anne-Marie stopped suddenly and stood still on the path. There was a turn immediately ahead. Beyond it, she knew, as soon as she rounded the turn, she would see the landscape open to the sea. The woods would be behind her there, and ahead of her would be the harbor, the docks, and the countless fishing boats. Very soon it would be noisy there, with engines starting, fishermen calling to one another, and the gulls crying. But she had heard something else. She heard the bushes rustling ahead. She heard footsteps, and she was certain it was not her imagination. She heard a low growl. Cautiously, she took a step forward, and another. She approached the turn in the path, and the noises continued. Then they were there, in front of her, 4 armed soldiers. With them, straining at taut leashes, were 2 large dogs, their eyes glittering and their lips curled.